Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our panel session, Leading Teams in a New World. Unprecedented challenges, new ways of working, fast changing expectations. The role of the leader has been transformed in 6 months. How have three of the sector's very best adapted their approaches, built new skills, and protected their people in the crisis? I am delighted to be joined today by Paula Coughlan, Chief People Officer at Dixons Carphone, Paul Szumilewicz, Global Head of Agile, Global Marketing, HSBC, and Tracey Clements, Chief Operating Officer, Boots UK and Republic of Ireland. Welcome, all three of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here. I wanted to take us back 6 months to start with and just get each of you to reflect on what it was like in those first few weeks of the crisis as a leader of people. And how you noticed you had to adapt, how quickly you had to adapt. What was the experience like in those first few weeks? Tracey, maybe if we could start with you.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I think of it now as different phases. So there was the phase just before the lockdown, which was the panic buying phase, and that required basically a lot of very urgent questions around how to procure as much stock as possible, what customers were buying. We sadly had to kind of every day put limitations on certain products to ensure customers could all access them. And that was kind of very daily responsiveness, I would say, was the big word at that stage. And then as we moved into the actual lockdown itself, I think Boots found itself in a slightly unusual position in that the essential, non-essential definition. We were an essential retailer, but a huge part of our stores, especially our biggest ones, is actually non-essential in terms of beauty halls. So some of the decisions at that point were all around how we ensured that we protected colleagues and customers. And they were tough calls. You know, it's very difficult to ask half of your population to go home and ask the others to still come to work during the height of the pandemic. And at that point in particular, the GP surgeries had tended to close their doors, and we saw a lot of patients coming into Boots stores for advice. So the levels of decision making that we had to make during that early phase, and I think probably digging deep and just making some big calls, not knowing whether you were making the right one. So there was a lot of thinking on your feet, and just, as for me, I just went back into my experience and try to think what's the right thing in this situation. You know, I don't think any of us have a comparison, but I've been in similar challenging situations, and making sure you had all the facts and could make the decision and then went with it. And you knew that you were probably going to have to keep reviewing that decision. For leaders, I think not having the answer and not being 100% certain was probably the biggest challenge during that early phase.
Paula, what was your experience like in those early days?
Well, similar to Tracey in many ways, there was no playbook. You know, we had to really think as everybody else did as we went. And I think for us, and the way that we adapted, first of all, we had to do what I describe as radical simplification. So it was about stripping back the agenda. You know, we, like many organisations, had programs of change, steering groups. It was all there. So we stripped it back to focusing on the three things that really mattered. And that was keeping colleagues safe, helping customers, and securing the future of the business. And when you get down to that simplicity, it becomes much easier to rally the rest of the organisation around that simple agenda. So not only do you say this is the action that we're taking, it becomes an individual call to action as well for every individual leader in the business to help guide what they need to be doing. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing is just structuring all of our communications around that. So for me as a leader, you know, whether I'm in one-to-ones or team meetings, it becomes around those three simple things. And those are the things that really matter. And then on an organisational front as well. So, and I think the final thing I'd say is that as we strip things away, we developed new levels of nimbleness. Chris, we were able to move really quickly, and we got to the heart of who's got the D on things, who's the decision maker, and let's make sure that that person's got the right cast of characters around them to move quickly. That's particularly the case with our online business. As the stores closed and the sales shifted online, very high demand there.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, indeed. Paul, did much of that resonate with you? How quickly did things shift from your perspective?
Absolutely, Chris. I would echo a lot of those comments. I mean, that period, which feels a lifetime ago, I don't know about you guys, February feels like 3-4 years ago, was a very uncomfortable period. When you asked that question, the first thing that came to my mind was just uncomfortable. And I think I agree with, we focused quickly on communication, open about the need to be agile, because, respectfully, in most industries, I'm sure many of us were making it up as we went along within reason, right? We have BCP plans, etc. But it was a really, really tough, uncomfortable period. And I think what came out very, very quickly for us was, how do we prioritize the safety of people? And it's to some extent maybe a bit of a cliche comment, but quite important, because you can get carried away with how do we keep everything going, and actually at a point you say, wait, stop a second, we need to look after people, because actually if our people start getting really sick, we're not going to be able to do anything that we would normally need to do to support customers. So I think, and I'm sure similar in most industries, you quickly remember how important your people are, because if your people start getting really ill, when many of them start getting COVID, everything falls over.
Yeah. I mean, all three of you sort of alluded to having to lead through. Paul, you used the word uncomfortable. Tracey, you talked about suddenly not having the answers that you might normally have. Paul, you talk about suddenly having to make some very big calls that work very differently. How as people did you get comfortable with that uncomfortableness? Paul, maybe you pick up on that start.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer, to be perfectly honest, Chris, because I think back to other kind of tough moments, and maybe that is the answer. I kind of in that period think about what are some of the tough moments I've had in my kind of career, and how do you get through those? And you kind of remind yourself that a little bit of calm, a little bit of pause, a little bit of reflection. And I think in that period, you quite quickly to move, what are the important things to do, right? In all of our weeks, and people listening, we have so many things to do, right? In management leadership roles. But I think in a time of crisis, it becomes perversely quite easy to prioritize. And there's a lot of things that become a lot less important, which, in any other day, your governance meetings or, an important presentation or whatever it may be, kind of takes over life, and suddenly you realize there's a much bigger world out there when there's really serious things going on. So I think definitely perspective. I think the other thing for me, interestingly, was one of the things that came to mind when you asked the questions. The question is, I did a lot more running than I ever did in that period. So actually being able, and everyone has different things, and it certainly wasn't always easy to find the time. But when you are saving time on commuting, etc., my kind of mental health almost rebalance and de-stresses just being able to get out for 40 minutes, rain or shine. And, the world after that always seems a little bit less stressful and anxious.
Yeah. Tracey, you talked about sort of looking back on experience and trying to fall back on some past experience, but you also talked about just trying to do the right thing. So was there a lot of gut feel decisions that you felt you take in this period?
Yeah, definitely, especially in the early days. And I think as leaders, we do all our different analysis, Myers-Briggs over the years, all the different things, and you sort of learn elements about yourself. And I was pulling on those. I was recognizing I tend to be instinctful, and I was listening to that instinct. But then I would double check, because I think the key thing around the early days was, whereas leaders, you sometimes can delegate into experts, we all were learning new detail. So there was no way you could just allow someone else to have all the details on whether it be face masks, perspex screens, furlough scheme. You had to know that detail as well. And then I would make the instinctful decision backed up by all that data. And quite often cross my fingers, Chris, right? You know, in reality, there were many days where I was like, and I'm fortunate in my exec role here. There's a colleague of mine that I've known for 20 years. And he did say to me about 6 weeks in, he'd never seen me as calm in my life. And I kind of took on this new strange calmness, but it helped me to slow down, and even like physically slow myself down. I think a little bit of working from home for people helped that, because you can find that time a bit. And, you know, sometimes just hang the call up and say, I'm going to come back to you in 5-10 minutes. And I would go for a walk, a bit like what Paul's saying around running. I might go for a walk, digest it a bit, and then be like, right, we're going to go this direction. But quite often with my fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. Paula, you've spoken about taking complexity out of the organisation, but did that also require you to lead in a different way and communicate in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I just think keeping everything I had to keep everything so simple. One of the first things we did was we trained actually all the leaders on the concepts of haiku. So we got into this Leading Through Crisis series, and a haiku of Tracey and Paula nodding. So it's this kind of simple 3-line, I think it's Japanese way of writing poetry when you've got 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and another 5 syllables. And every message that we needed to get across needed to have that degree of clarity and simplicity. And the big 3 priorities that I talked about earlier, that kind of helped all of us to construct our communications. But that was really, and for me personally, it was just, you know, everything that I did had to be simple and it had to be clear. And not only with my own team, because we were working through some very complicated issues. You know, we furloughed 16,000 colleagues. We're at the later stages redeploying quite a lot of colleagues into our contact centres and into sort of our Shop Live, which was our online personal shopping, and many other things. And just to kind of lead through that complexity in the tough times, I had to keep things really, really simple. I mean, one of the things as well, Paul was talking about walking and movement. One of the things that I applied to myself was the idea of putting your oxygen mask on first before you put it on others. And I realised pretty quickly with the working hours and the Teams meetings and everything that, you know, walking around, exercise, you know, taking care of yourself, taking care of myself was going to be so important in terms of my ability to look after others. And really, you know, my role was really all around keeping people safe and reinforcing that through the organisation.
Yes, absolutely. Tracey, that idea of taking care of yourself, ensuring that you don't become overloaded, in the role that you had going through this, you know, overseeing all of the operational side of Boots, were there times where it felt overwhelming? Were there times that you felt that actually I can't take that decision, I can't cope, you know, with another decision to make, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, I coined the phrase decision fatigue. You know, I would say I have got decision fatigue today. I've made too many and I can't make any more. And I would recognise and work out which ones had to be made today and which ones maybe could wait tomorrow. Sometimes you had to make the decision in the hour. And then I delegated a lot as well and asked for others with expertise. So we similarly to Paula, we had a massive shift online. The majority of Boots.com capacity comes from a warehouse, an automated warehouse, but I realised early that was not going to cope with the demand and that I would need to have hybrid stores, so stores where we pick the parcels. And I asked one of my exec colleagues to take that on and build a team and run it as agile as they could. And 10 days later, they opened it. And I think in the interim, I had like 3 calls where they quickly updated me. And I, you know, I had to let that go. And previously, I suspect I would have wanted to be more involved, but there was so many other things going on that it was about, you have to give the trust to that team. They're all really capable of doing it, and allow others to come and do some of the big projects quickly.
Yeah, and in many ways, it's quite a brave decision to make in order to relinquish control of something that large. But my sense is that the importance of bravery from leaders and showing that, not just bravery, I bet, but I think authenticity has been incredibly important during this time. Paul, have you seen that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think one of the things, and I was fortunate with some of the senior execs I work with, I think very early on there was a number of key leaders which were very open and showed vulnerability. So I think that balance of showing strength and calm, and I loved what Tracey talked about in terms of just maintaining calm whilst not pretending that, too often there's this view that senior leaders are smarter than everyone else and have lots more information, and they might have a bit more information, but respectfully, I think smarter is not necessarily true. So the power of being able to say, look, some of the information and some of the decisions we're making are based on what we know so far. And again, Tracey mentioned, which I loved, the openness of saying that might change next week. And that happened very often with us, where we said, we're going to be doing this, we're going to mobilize, and then a new bit of information comes in. And I think if you're open from the beginning about not that certainty of this is what we're going to do, this is what's going to work, it's much easier to be able to navigate. And again, I think Paula used it also, the term agile, which I suppose is close to heart for me and the role I do at the moment, but creating that kind of corporate agility. Perversely, times like COVID really test that, and I'm sure many other industries, and Tracey and Paula will have this, there's so many things that we hope we can keep doing post-COVID that we've learned we can do, which we always said was too hard to do.
Well, and that's a great point, isn't it? I mean, I think there are two sides to that discussion. I guess there's organisationally, look, what is going to stick around the decisions organisations have taken. And then I think there's just the very nature of leadership itself and how this may have evolved, the lens through which we view great leadership. Paula, I'm intrigued to learn a little bit more about how you've taken complexity out of the organisation, but also actually the decision to identify where decisions were going to be made in the organisation. Is that something that you think will stick now, that kind of structure?
Yes, I do actually. So one of the things that we did probably in the next phase of the crisis, I think it was probably around May time, was we gathered the top 50 or so leaders together, and we said, look, this has been a very, very tough time, but good things are coming out of it. Better collaboration, more sense of common purpose, quicker decision making, everything. So we said, right, what are we going to take? And actually the remote working in some ways has its downsides, but also was bringing some benefits. So we said, right, okay, what do we want to bottle? Because what I didn't want to do, and I think Alex, the CEO, wanted to do, was to tell people. We wanted to really engage them in that. And there are a few things that came out of it, and I can talk about this, but one of them was, look, let's not lose this kind of nimbleness. So what we did throughout the summer, we went on a 6-week sprint, actually, no consultants allowed, to redefine the operating model of the business. And for the first time ever, we created an operating model because there wasn't one. We wrote it down. We got some of our best leaders. We empowered them. We brought them into the team. Very small team of people working on this. So typically this is something, as we all know, there's the steering groups, there's the political agendas, there's everybody who wants their point of view, there's armies of consultants that can get involved in this. Very small group of our most trusted leaders to say, right, how do we simplify this business? And how do we do it in a way that's going to deliver the most value to customers and to colleagues? And so we did that. We launched it probably a couple of weeks ago. So those ways of working have actually been almost crystallized into a formal operating model going forward. And we set out all of the new decision rights as well. You've either got the D in something, you're a decision maker, or you're giving advice. That's not everybody, by the way. That's a small number of trusted expert people, or you're being informed because you need to execute something, and that's the speed that we're looking to get. So that's sticking, and we're spending a lot of time now on how do we sustain that change and make it real. But that sprung out of the crisis. That's something that's enduring.
Tracey, you've talked about things changing, every couple of weeks. There have been decisions that you've made that you've then had to reverse. I guess, first of all, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about what it was like to make decisions, find out that they weren't quite right, and have to go back to colleagues and change them. And then secondly, just picking up on the strand of thought from Paula there, what has stuck? What do you believe is going to stick at Boots from what you've implemented over the last month or 2 months or so?
Yeah, so I think on the first point, we've all talked about communication was so key during this crisis. And just prior to the crisis, we had started to have more regular conversations with our store managers and using Zoom and things. So as obviously things were quite fraught, we were speaking to our store managers and our pharmacists every week, sometimes actually more than that. And what I did was I was always very clear. I would say I'm always going to look down the line, down the camera, and tell them exactly what's happening and show transparency around where we are. And I think in doing that, you were then able to say, look, the guidance on pharmacy was quite distinct to the guidance on retail. So at times you'd be saying there's a new rule for the pharmacy part, for example, when you say, where did you maybe have to change? But because we'd explained the why, I'm always very clear that in anything that we do, we must explain why, what, where, when, how kind of thing, in any comms plan, a bit like the haiku example Paula said. For me, it's really important to explain why. And sometimes I'd have to be super candid. I'd say we have to do this because we're 60% down on sales. And the managers would write and go, great, get it. The pharmacist would say, right, I get that, I understand. And we got into a much better level of dialogue. And I think that will stay. We still speak to our store managers once a week and our pharmacists once a week on a Thursday evening. They feel that they can tell us everything, sometimes both barrels. And that's fine because we will not fix it if we don't know.
Yeah.
In terms of things that'll stick, we'll definitely pick from store will stick. I'm really glad that we got that going. In many ways we should have been doing that. And then I think this approach to working that I've heard from both of you guys around putting little teams together with all the key skills and saying, you've got like 6 weeks to, build this and come back and whatever you need, you have access to it. I'm really hopeful, as is Seb, I know that that we maintain that approach to much more agile and fast delivery.
Right. Paul, what stuck for you, particularly, I guess, at a personal level, where in terms of, going forward and leading teams in the future, what do you think has stuck for you?
Yeah, I think if I just add in a couple of quick comments that are more broader, then I'll come back to me because stimulated by what Paula and Tracey said. It was interesting. I had to quite quickly, I made a decision to move about 1,000 colleagues onto certain tech that allowed them to be more effective working from home. And actually, I can share that in terms of we use Monday.com, which actually allowed people to, something that was actually quite hard to get into the organization to a point with some individuals. Within 2 to 4 weeks, we had 1,000 people working on Monday.com, where you have boards on different projects. People contribute at the same time. You can have internal, external agencies contribute from a marketing perspective. The effectiveness of that just blew people away in terms of why were we not doing that previously? Respectfully, COVID or no COVID, it is such a great way of working in a world where you're interacting with lots of people and in a global business as well, all over the world at different time zones. So I think those kind of things really landed well, and I think will stick. I think the other obvious one for us is that clearly, and for most industries, I suspect in companies, there was a real material shift in customer behavior towards digital. And a lot of that, I think, is not going to necessarily switch off suddenly when everything opens up, because customers have found easier ways of doing things. That actually also created and pushed us quite quickly to support our colleagues to be able to work remotely. For example, call center colleagues, where we have thousands of people to be able to effectively do that from home, for many people actually worked really, really well. And I'm fascinated by, when we go back, how do you maintain a certain level of flexibility? And maybe that leads a bit more nicely to me as a leader, being much more open to, you know, if I can say respectfully, banking can be a little bit old fashioned, to actually much more open to new ways of working. The ability for most jobs can probably be done working from home, you know, apart from customer facing, clearly, to a point. So actually that's still something that's a big reflection for me to make sure we don't lose some of that agility and actually some of the goodness that's brought to a lot of people who have been able to work from home.
Yeah. We've got sort of about 5 minutes left. So one question to each of you, and then we'll probably be out of time. But I'm intrigued. Well, a lot of the audience today will be young or first-time leaders in their careers, and I'm intrigued by your advice to them around are there a new set of expectations from colleagues about what they need from their leaders now, having gone through this, and I guess as a result, then actually customers as well. If you're in leading teams that are customer facing, what are the new expectations of the DNA of a great leader going forward? Tracey, maybe we start with you.
I think for me, it's always a bit around being a bit obsessed by people. So whether they're your customers or whether they're your colleagues, having an understanding of how they live their lives is, for retailers in particular, I think is a skill that we all need, because if you understand how people are living their lives, at the moment, that's things like we don't want to shop as much, they want to be more digital, they want more advice online, then you develop the products and services that they need. So it comes down to empathy for me always, in terms of that ability to kind of put yourself in people's shoes. And I think leaders need to show that. Clearly, I always believe humility is a very core skill for any leader, because if then people tell you more, and the more they tell you the truth, the more you learn and the more that you improve the business. And I think for this crisis, it's rare that you actually say in your job that you're in life or death, but we actually were. And I think being honest about how that makes you feel, like the enormity of the role you actually have, and, you know, holding that position and showing the utmost respect to the position you have as a leader, and therefore the decisions that you're going to make, you can't make them quickly. You have to remember all of those colleagues on the end of that decision. So they would be some of the big ones. And I think you and I spoke last week, bravery is probably the biggest 6 months of I always talk about, take a deep breath. When I talk to younger mentees, I'll always say, take a deep breath and make the call, you know, and I've probably taken more deep breaths than I ever did prior in this last 6 months.
Yes, I'm sure. Paula, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, three things, I think. So my advice would be to create that sort of sense of galvanizing purpose and agenda and meaning in it. So it's not hard to find that at the moment, actually, in terms of what we're all doing. But I think meaning is really important. Empathy, just putting into the shoes of other people, and just creating moments for just informal check-ins when you kind of understand how people are doing. Be a bit of a CFO, and or find a CFO. When I see CFO, not in the traditional sense, but a chief fun officer.
Yeah.
So create just like some fun within the group as well. And not everyone is great at doing that, but find someone within the team who is, and use that person and include people. So we're working now remotely. There's going to be more hybrid working. Some people will be in the room. Some people will be remote. So just find the best way to make everyone part of it. And I think to do those things, leaders have got to do a few things to create the space for those things to happen. And that's to put their own mask on, take control of their agenda and their meetings, and just kind of keep things really simple, because that declutters, in order for them to do those things and to do them well.
Fantastic advice. Paul?
Yeah, no, I would echo everything that's been said. I think the one phrase I always use, and I don't think it's changed, and it was the piece of advice I got early in my leadership journey, in terms of what differentiates great leadership, which is genuinely care about your people. And I think in a time of crisis and in a remote world when we're on Zoom, you almost have to over-index on that, because much harder to do it, over the phone, on the camera, where you're trying to read body language and genuinely say, hey, how are you doing? Everything okay? How are the kids? Whatever it may be, right? It's not easy to fake that. And I've seen a lot of people try and fake it. So people know, I know when people are faking it with me. So it's not easy advice, because genuinely caring about your people, you have to work at, and you have to spot either signs on an email, on a call, whatever it may be, which might just say, hey, everything okay? Anything I can do to help? Whatever it may be. So not an easy one, but I love the simplicity of, similar to what Tracey said, and it absolutely ties in with empathy, but genuinely care about your people. And how do you do that as a leader?
Fantastic. And that a great place for us to finish. I think over and over again over these 3 days, we've heard more and more about the importance of people and the care for them, which is fantastic to hear. I'm sorry that we haven't got longer. It's been fabulous talking to all three of you, Paula, Paul and Tracey. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of the days.
Thank you.
Thank you.